It's happened to me, I'm sure it's happened to you, but sooner or later you're going to get dust on your sensor. My name is Nick Rains from Leica Academy Australia, and in this video I'm going to show you how I keep my camera clean, my lens clean, and how I remove those bits of dust off your sensor. Here's a bit of an overview about some of the bits and pieces that you might need to keep your equipment clean. First and foremost, simply keeping the camera clean is always a good idea, and you can use pretty much anything for that. Micropore cloths are fine, but don't use the same micropore cloth that you use for cleaning the camera for cleaning the lens, because the camera itself is going to get much dirtier than the lens or the sensor, or in theory anyway, because you want to be protecting the lens, and obviously the sensor is inside and it's only exposed when you take the lens off. So the outside of the camera can be kept clean with maybe a bigger one of these micropore cloths, or a simple lint-free cloth like a duster. And if you're really stuck and you're really being very pedantic about keeping your camera clean, you can get these wet wipes that VSGO make, which come in a little box like this, and it's essentially an alcohol-free wipe, sort of thing that you might use to clean spectacles, and they're good for getting off stubborn bits of goo from in the cracks and so on and so forth. But again, that's kind of cosmetic. It's not going to really affect the photograph itself. So a micropore cloth should be dedicated to the lens and certainly never used on the sensor. That's absolutely, don't do that. Okay, so micropore cloths are great. Leica sell them, of course, in the stores. They come in a nice little packet like this. Very cute. Keep those in your bag. I've got a bunch of them. They work really well. Second thing you're going to need for lenses is either a lens pen, which is this, which has a little carbon fiber pad on the end, which you can use to gently, in a circular motion, scrub away. Say scrub, sounds a bit scary, just ease away a fingerprint or a bit of grease. Because most of the time you should be able to keep your lens clean with a clean micropore cloth and one of these. And this is something that I highly recommend, is a good quality blower brush. This one actually has a user changeable filter built into the air intake, so when you're blowing completely clean air. Now some people think that when you use a blower you tend to just distribute the dust, into the camera further. That may be true, but it's great for getting off dust off the front of a lens element, and you really want to get the loose stuff off first, because if you've got a little bit of something that's not soft, let's say just a little bit of dust, which could be, if you magnified it, it looks like a rock, you don't want to be putting your micropore cloth onto that and scrubbing it around, because that might cause some abrasion problems. What you want to be doing is getting the worst off with your blower brush and then use the micropore. Something else with this, just as a point of order really, when you're using this, particularly if you're cleaning out inside the sensor box, it's not so important for the lens, is if you squeeze like this, it's really hard to keep the nozzle pointing in the right direction. You can see it moving around. But if you change your grip and hold it in your fist like that, and then just move your fingers up and down, you should see that that nozzle is pretty stable, because if you're poking it around inside the camera, you don't want it to be flapping around. So that sort of motion seems to work best. There is another little gizmo here that I'll show you how it works in a little while. That's a sticky stick. I don't know what else to call it. It's essentially got a piece of very, very highly sticky plastic on the end of a stick, but it's a special adhesive that does not leave behind a residue, and you quite literally stick it onto the sensor and pull it off, and it pulls off quite well adhered bits of dirt. It's a bit daunting to use. I'll show you how that works, but you don't use those on sensors that are stabilised, because obviously there's a mechanism that makes the sensor move around, and that's quite delicate. It's perfectly fine to use on cameras with fixed sensors. So the M series cameras are fine, the CL cameras are fine, but the SL2 and the SL2S definitely not. We've got another way of doing that, which is the sensor swabs. And this is a little triangular piece of plastic on the end of a stick, which you put a tiny tiny drop of fluid onto, and then you wipe across the sensor once. And it's a little bit daunting, but I'll show you how to do that in a sec. So that's gone from cameras to lenses to sensors, and the sensors are the scary bits. So again, just be careful, like super careful. Whatever you do, you're on your own. You have to take full responsibility for anything that you might do which is not ideal, like damaging it or in some fashion. Just take it super careful. You don't need to be paranoid about it, but just be very light with your touch, and I'll show you how that all works in a sec. So the first thing we'll do is we'll just do a lens clean, then we'll do a sensor clean. Okay, so let's move on with those. Okay, let's talk about lens cleaning. Now, lens cleaning is pretty straightforward, but I should stress not to overthink it too much. You're never going to get the last little speck of dust off the front of your lens, and that little speck of dust has zero effect on the image quality. What you're looking for is the bigger things, like big smears or damage, obviously, or things stuck to the front, anything significant. The last little bits of dust, you're just never going to get them off. I mean, even in where I am right now, which is a pretty clean room, there's dust in the air, and by the time I finish cleaning it, you'll probably see some dust has landed on the front of the lens anyway, because the camera I've got that's looking at the front of the lens, it's going to give you quite a close-up view, so it's very unforgiving. So there's kind of 4 levels to lens cleaning. There's the basic wipe it over on the outside. Then there's the shifting the dust off the front, which will usually involve just blowing the dust off. Then you've got the micropore cloth, which we talked about before. And then if that doesn't work, you've got wet wipes and a lens pen. So the lens pen is kind of a last resort for me. I only use that when I've got something that I simply can't get off any other way. I do use the brush part of it, but the little pad on the end is a last resort for me. And if that's not working immediately, I think that's when I need to stop and take it into a proper cleaning place and get it done with different chemicals and different swabs and so on. So let's just talk about what you can do yourself at home, which is the way I do my own camera maintenance. So the first thing is to have a good look at the lens itself, and I'm going to have to put my reading glasses on because these are a bit more close up. So let me just do that. So looking at this lens now, it's actually pretty clean. I do keep my stuff in reasonable condition, certainly the optical parts of it as well. So you need to assess the lens and have a good look. And I tend to have a good look at different angles and just to make sure about what we're up against. And right now that's looking pretty good. So let me just show you the steps I would use. First of all, I'd give it a good blow over, and I'm going to just puff any bits of dust off like this. And I'll use that in combination with my brush, part of the lens pen, because in the cracks around the outside it does tend to gather dust, and this will flick them off. Okay, now again, that sort of dust is never going to be a problem optically, but if you want to be really pedantic about it, you might as well shift those bits of dust off. And once you've brushed it, of course, you need to blow it again, because you don't want to. Any dust that you've dislodged will need to be removed. So pop that off like that. So once I've blown off any loose dust, I will use the micropore cloth to do a little bit more of a wipe over. And just be careful to try and pick one side to use for the lens and the other side to touch on your hand. I use the little Leica spot so I know which side is which. Very useful. And I'll just wrap that around my hand like that so I can get a grip on it. There we go. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to gently wipe that over the face of the lens like that. Circular motions from the middle out. And then have another good look. And that, again, just try and keep the inside of the cloth separate. So I'm going to put it down folded slightly so the inside is protected from even the desktop. Have a good look at that. If there's anything you can see more dust-wise, give it a good popping off. Now, if there was something that was a little bit more significant, like some sort of smear, I don't really want to go scrubbing at that smear with the cloth. That's really just to give it a clean, get the dust off it. If you've got something a bit more permanent, a bit more significant, especially things like, for instance, if you've been shooting near the sea, you get sea spray on the lens, just little bits, you'll find that has dried onto the surface, and a brush and a wipe simply won't shift it because it's basically crusty salt. So what I would use is one of these wet wipes. These are VSGO wet wipes, which are non-alcoholic. Don't know exactly what the chemicals are, but they are amazingly effective, and they seem to leave no smears behind at all. So I often just bunch it up into a little pad, and then I'll work that around, and you should see that that's not leaving any trail behind it. And that is damp enough to dissolve off the salt crust. And I hope the video is picking up that there's no smeary residue being left behind. And from this angle, looking at it now, that is pretty good. And these are obviously single use, so I'll just put that there. Last little pop of the brush just in case, and we are done. Something else to bear in mind, and there it is, I've lost it, is when you put the lens cap back on again, you may have dust in the mechanism and the lens cap, so it's always a good idea just to give that a bit of a brush and a bit of a blow. And I tend to do that upside down so that any dust will come out and fall down, and then let's put that on there like that, and we're done. Now don't forget, of course, that there is the rear element of the lens to look at, so do check that. Same thing applies, same techniques, give it a blow, a little bit of dust there. And if you see any smears, and there shouldn't be, because this should either have a rear cap on, or it should be attached to the camera, so this should stay pretty clean. You can still use the same wet wipe, brush, same technique, but that to me looks pretty good. So I'll put the lens back on again, lens cap back on again, and we are good. All right. The next part of the process is a little bit more daunting, and that's when we come to clean the sensor. Now, if your sensor has been looked after, and you've been very careful about when you change lenses, and you've been protecting the camera as best you can against the elements, you'll probably find that every now and again you get a little speck of dust on it. Nothing too much to worry about. If you're shooting stills, you can pretty easily remove that in post-production, but it's a pain. If you're shooting video, it's very difficult to remove a dust spot from the sensor, particularly if it's in the sky or something like that. It's going to be really obvious. And if you've got a moving subject behind the actual dust spot, so that whatever's behind it in the scene is moving around, it's really hard to retouch out. It's possible in Apple's Adobe After Effects or Apple's Motion. It's possible, but it's really advanced stuff. So best have a clean sensor. How do you know whether your sensor's clean? Well, there's a couple of ways of checking. First of all is you can simply look at it, and if you take off the lens and you can just eyeball it with my reading glasses on, and what you want to do is reflect something bright. I'm reflecting my main light over here onto the sensor, and you should be able to see anything major. And I can see one speck of dust on there. Anything serious, you'll see very obviously. Anything less serious, like small specks, you may have difficulty seeing. So you need to give it a good eyeball. Buy some glasses like +3, +4, or use a jeweler's glasses or even a magnifying glass to get right in there. But there is a really, really good way of finding out without going to any of that sort of trouble. Let me just show you how to do that. Put the lens back on. There we are. What you need to do is take a photograph of something even, so with no detail to it, that's slightly bright and is out of focus and is at a very, very narrow aperture. Because when you shoot at a very narrow aperture, not only do you get depth of field in front of the lens, but you get the equivalent of depth of field behind the lens. It's called depth of focus. What that means is that when you shoot at f/22, any dust on your sensor will be picked up sharper in the image itself. If you shoot wide open at f2.8 or something, you may find that dust, which isn't exactly on the sensor, it's on the glass in front of the sensor, and the glass thickness does vary from one camera manufacturer to another. On the Leica cameras, it's extremely thin, so the dust is very close to the sensor physically. With thicker glass, the dust is further away, therefore is more blurred when it's depicted on the sensor. So shooting wide open, you often don't even see the dust, but when you shoot at f/22, oh boy, do you see the dust, and you may be quite astonished. So let me show you how to test that. First of all, just put the camera onto, it's not super critical, but I've got the camera on auto ISO. I've got it on f/22, or whatever the narrowest aperture you've got handy with that particular lens. And I've got the exposure compensation set to +1, and I'm just simply pointing it at my desk right here, because it's a nice pale, even lit area. and I don't want it to be sharp. I want to turn off the autofocus. I want to make sure it's defocused completely. And I want a completely blurred, pale image. And then it doesn't matter what the shutter speed is at all. Just take the picture. Okay, so let's see what we've got here. Play, and then magnify. And there's a hair right away. And that's the section of the sensor I'm magnifying. And it's at f22. And what I would do is I would sweep across using the joystick, looking for more dust, go along, down, back across, down, and so on, looking for dust. But I want to show you what this looks like at different aperture. Hopefully you can see that hair okay. That's shot at f22. See what happens when I go to f4. That was a previous shot I did at f4, and it's gone. Back to f22, and there it is. So if you're shooting at f4, that hair would never be a problem. But if you're shooting at f22, that hair is a problem. So something to be aware of. There obviously comes a point where a hair or a dust spot or whatever is so big that it becomes visible at any aperture. But if you're shooting wide open, dust will be less of a problem than if you're shooting at a very stopped down aperture. So that's how you check, A, that it needs sensor cleaning, and B, after you've done the sensor cleaning, you know that you've actually completed the task successfully. So it's a good check at the end of the process. If you don't find any dust, you don't need to clean the sensor. All right, so we found dust. What do we do next? Okay, sensor cleaning is a little bit daunting, I know, and there's a couple of things we need to talk about. Firstly, there's two different types of sensor. There's sensors are fixed into the chassis of the camera, and then there's sensors that have some sort of stabilizer mechanism so that the actual sensor can float around and counteract any movement of the camera. They need to be treated in different ways. A lot of cameras still have fixed sensors. They don't have that stabilizer mechanism built in, and all of the Leica M series cameras, for instance, have that too. You will need to go into the menus to open up the shutter, because on the M series cameras, even though they're mirrorless cameras, there is a shutter which sits in front of the sensor permanently when the camera is powered down. So you will need to go into the menus and go to the sensor cleaning options, and when you trigger that, the shutter lifts away so you can see the sensor. Then when you turn the camera off again, it drops back down again. But it's still a fixed sensor. Now what I have here in front of me is the actual sensor from a Leica M9. We use it for demonstrating what sensors look like in training and so on, but it makes it a perfect demonstration subject for how to clean it. The tool that I've been using on my previous cameras, which was the SL and the previous cameras, M240, M9, S system cameras, they're all fixed sensors, and I've been using this device, which is essentially a piece of sticky plastic on the end of a stick. That's all it really is. And the stickiness of this is specially formulated that it doesn't leave behind a residue. And what you do is you simply open up your camera and you do the test to find out where the dust spots are. But even then, you can just work your way methodically across the camera sensor. And I will do that on this little one here. And I would start in one corner and I would simply press it down like this. Now this is scary stuff, but the first time I did it, it scared me to death, but once I got used to it, it's fine. I'll just press it on, and you can actually see a little patch of where it's stuck down, like when you press something wet against a window, you get that sort of patch. And I just work my way along, and you may notice I'm rolling it slightly. I don't want to pull directly, because that will be stressing the glass front a bit more, and I'm not sure how firmly fixed on it is. For all I know, it's incredibly robust, but I'm not taking any chances. You just work your way across like this, and you can get right into the corners. Just do it methodically, right the way across, and you will be amazed how effective this is. It's also something you can do in the field. It's very, very easy to carry one of these around with you, and if you keep checking your sensor, if you see any dust at all, you can whip this out and just grab that tiny piece of dust, and it'll be gone. Very, very effective, but like I say, a little bit daunting. You would not want to do that on a stabilized sensor camera. So we have a different method for doing that, but I just wanted to show you what it looks like on here. So I'm going to use this same demo sensor to show you the swabbing tools, because it's just easier for you to see it. I tried to video the inside of the camera, and it's really hard to get an angle with my fingers with the swab so you can see what's going on. So much easier if I show you this. So let's move on to the actual wet swabbing, which is the other technique we'll use for stabilized sensor cameras. For those cameras like the SL2 and the SL2S, which have stabilized sensors, we need to be slightly more careful in our approach. The way to actually clean the camera is to turn the camera on when you're doing the cleaning, not off, because when it's off, the sensor, the motors that hold it in place are obviously not on, and the whole sensor is sitting quite loosely in its chassis. And if you take the front of the lens, take the front of the camera off, take the lens off, and look when the camera's turned off, and just move the camera carefully, you'll see it shimmy around a bit. So it's not in a very firm position. When you turn the camera on, the motors are activated and it's held in a much firmer position. But you really don't want to be poking hard at it, so everything you do has got to be done delicately. That's why I prefer not to use these sticky devices for stabilized sensors, because you've got to stick it on and pull it off, and that's a force forwards and backwards, which really is not a good idea. So we're going to use these swabs. And these are the VSGO swabs, and they come in two different sizes, one for full frame cameras and one for APS-C size cameras. So you just pick the one that's the right size for you. They're single use, so don't reuse them, and they look like that. Put that out of the way. That's all it is, and you'll notice that if I move that into contact with the sensor, it's exactly the same width as the sensor itself. So it's very straightforward. It's just something that you will get used to by doing it, and don't be scared. If you have an older camera with a fixed sensor, it might be a good idea to practice on that, just to get a sense of what it feels like. Because like I say, the first time you do this will be quite scary. One drop of the cleaning fluid in the middle, like that, and it will spread sideways. You just leave it for 10 seconds, and if you look very closely at it, you'll see it spreading sideways. If it doesn't spread all the way across, you might just want to put a tiny bit more on there. You don't want to put too much on, but you want to make sure the swab is actually wet across. It'll be wetter on one side than the other, which is kind of important. So then you will use the wet side that you just dampened, and you will move it into contact with the sensor's face, and you will touch it gently on there, and you will drag it across in one smooth movement, and then you will drag it back, which is the drier side, in one smooth movement, like that. That's it. Then you stop, and if I look very carefully at that, that is very, very clean. If you find there's one little spot which won't come off, very, very carefully, you can use the corner to just try and work that little spot off, but stop if it doesn't come off very soon, and then take the camera to a proper technician to get it cleaned. Do not poke and scrub and try and work it off. Just don't do that. If it doesn't come off easily with the corner, it's too firm for you to fix, and you're best off definitely taking it to an authorized technician to get it done in a more professional manner. They have different tools and different chemicals they can use. They can soak it, they've got different swabs and so on. This is an in-the-field clean, or a basic maintenance clean when you're at home. It's not a problem. It's not a technique that you would use if you got something really gummed onto your sensor. That requires professional help. So it's really as simple as that. It's a drop, maybe two, onto one side, let it soak across and through to a certain extent, one drag across with the wetter side, and then one drag back with the other side. That is basically it. Then, of course, you close the camera up, turn it on, take another test shot like I showed you before, step through the magnified view and make sure that the dust has gone. And if it's not gone, then you can do this again, and you can obviously use the blower brush, maybe shift that out as well. But if all else fails, again, do take it to an authorized technician to get it done properly. Don't try too hard. The lighter the touch, the better.